The fire crackled, a lone point of warmth in the vast, cold darkness of the Dakota Plains. It was a meager defense against the wind that swept down from the north, carrying the scent of dust and distant rain. Ruth huddled closer, pulling her threadbare shawl tight around her shoulders. Across the flames, Jedediah cleaned his rifle, his movements methodical and detached. He hadn't spoken more than a handful of words to her all day, and the silence between them was heavier than the miles they had traveled. "Jed," she began, her voice barely a whisper against the wind. "Is something amiss? You've been distant." He didn't look up, just continued wiping down the barrel with an oiled cloth. "Just thinking on the trail ahead. It gets rough from here, dangerous." "I know that," she said, a hint of defiance in her tone. "I've pulled my weight, I'm not afraid." Finally, he stopped. He laid the rifle aside and looked at her, his eyes as flat and gray as the twilight sky. "That's the problem, Ruth. You're not afraid enough. You're a liability I can't afford to carry into the Black Hills." He took a slow breath, the words coming out as cold and sharp as ice. "You ain't my wife no more." The pronouncement hung in the air, sucking the warmth from the fire and the breath from her lungs. He simply turned away, rolling himself into his bedroll as if he'd just commented on the weather. Shock gave way to a cold, trembling dread. He was leaving her. Here. Alone. Hours later, under the silver light of a full moon, with the sound of his steady breathing a cruel rhythm in the night, she moved. A desperate, quiet fury guided her to his saddlebag. Tucked deep inside, wrapped in oilskin, was a map. It wasn't a surveyor's map, but one drawn by hand, marked with a clear trail to a place labeled Silas's Folly. A mine. His true destination. Her resolve hardened. She silently saddled his strongest horse, packed what little food she could, and with the stolen map secure in her coat, rode west without a single look back. The pale light of dawn bled across the eastern horizon, painting the vast Dakota sky in shades of bruised purple and soft orange. The adrenaline that had fueled Ruth's flight through the night had evaporated with the morning dew, leaving a hollow ache of exhaustion and bone-deep loneliness. All around her was an endless sea of grass, swaying in the cool breeze, a landscape so immense it threatened to swallow her whole. She reined in Jasper, the powerful bay gelding whose steady breathing was the only sound besides the whisper of the wind. Her hands trembled as she pulled the folded map from her coat. It was crude, drawn on a piece of worn leather, with landmarks sketched in charcoal. A misshapen butte, a fork in a dry creek bed, a cluster of lone pines. It was both her salvation and a testament to the secret Jedediah had kept from her. A fresh wave of anger, sharp and clean, washed over her, momentarily eclipsing the fear. She wasn't just running away, she was running towards something. Urging Jasper on, she kept her eyes scanning the horizon, not for landmarks, but for the telltale dust cloud of a rider. Every shadow played tricks on her mind, morphing into the shape of her husband. By late afternoon, thirst was afire in her throat, and every muscle screamed in protest. The map indicated a small stream ahead. Hope, fragile as a bird's wing, fluttered in her chest. As the sun began its descent, she found it, a shallow, cottonwood-lined creek, almost hidden in a dip in the terrain. It was barely a trickle, but it was water. She slid from the saddle, her legs nearly buckling, and led Jasper to drink. She found a small, sheltered alcove, hidden from the open prairie. It wasn't much, but it was safe. It was hers. She had survived the first day. The small victory of the previous night gave way to a third day of grueling travel under a relentless sun. Ruth felt a change not just in the landscape, which was slowly beginning to ripple with low hills, but in the air itself. It grew heavy, thick with an unspoken promise of violence. By midday, the sky to the west had bruised to a dark purple gray, and a low rumble echoed across the plains, a sound more menacing than any animal's growl. Panic, cold and sharp, tried to seize her, but she forced it down. Jedediah would have cursed and pushed on recklessly. She would be smarter. She urged Apollo forward, her eyes scanning the terrain not for a path, but for refuge. The wind whipped her hair across her face, carrying the scent of rain and damp earth. She spotted it just as the first fat drops of rain began to fall, a shallow rock overhang, barely more than a scar on the side of a rising butte. It wasn't much, but it was something. She scrambled from the saddle, pulling a terrified Apollo with her, his ears pinned back as a deafening clap of thunder split the sky directly overhead. She tethered him deep under the meager shelter, using her own body to shield him from the driving rain that now came in horizontal sheets. She quickly checked the oilskin wrap on her supplies, cinching it tighter. For a terrifying hour, the world was nothing but wind, water, and the percussive blast of thunder. Huddled against her horse for warmth, soaked and shivering, Ruth felt utterly insignificant. As the storm's fury began to wane, a flash of lightning illuminated the plains, and her heart froze. Far to the south, silhouetted for a brief, stark second, were two riders. They were too distant to make out, but they were there. Her sanctuary suddenly felt like a trap. The dawn broke quiet and clean, the air washed fresh by the storm. But the ground told a different story. The Dakota prairie had transformed into a vast, sucking sea of mud. Every step Apollo took was a struggle, his hooves making a thick, slurping sound as he pulled them free. Progress was agonizingly slow, and the effort left both horse and rider slick, with sweat despite the cool morning air. The sighting of the riders had seared itself into Ruth's mind. Every shadow on the horizon was a potential threat, every gust of wind the sound of approaching hoofbeats. She felt exposed, a solitary figure crawling across an endless, muddy canvas. The mud made hiding her tracks impossible. Their path was a clear, gouged line pointing west. Hours later, as the midday sun began to bake the mud into a cracked crust, she saw it. A dark lump on the horizon, low and unnatural. Not a butte, not a stand of trees. It was a structure. As she drew closer, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs, it resolved into a sod house, a lonely soddy dug into the side of a slight rise. It looked abandoned, its grass roof slumped, the earth walls streaked and eroded by seasons of rain and snow. Her first instinct was to steer clear. It was a deviation from the map, an unknown variable in an already lethal equation. But her jerky was nearly gone, and the damp had seeped into her bedroll. The house, derelict as it was, whispered of shelter, of forgotten supplies, of a moment's respite from the elements. The risk was immense. The riders could be nearby, or its former inhabitants could return. But the potential reward was survival. Tying Apollo to a scraggly bush a safe distance away, she crept forward, the silence of the prairie pressing in on her as she reached for the weathered plank door. The air inside the sod house was thick and still, smelling of damp earth, dust, and the ghosts of old fires. A single beam of dusty light cut through a crack in the turf roof, illuminating a Spartan interior. A crude wooden table and a single, three-legged stool were the only furniture. The silence was profound, broken only by her own ragged breathing. Her hand trembled slightly as she ran it over the rough-hewn surface of the table, imagining a family gathered here, their faces lit by lamplight, their voices a murmur against the vast emptiness outside. On the packed earth floor, half buried in dust, lay a small, hand-carved bird, its wings smoothed by the touch of a child's hands. Ruth picked it up, a lump forming in her throat. This wasn't just an empty structure. It was a tomb of a family's dream. She saw a fleeting image of a little girl playing on this very spot, her laughter echoing in a space that was now achingly silent. Her search of the shelves yielded little, a cracked ceramic bowl, a rusted tin cup. But tucked away in a corner, she found what felt like treasure. A small, sealed tin containing salt, and next to it, a tightly wrapped oilcloth bundle with a precious handful of dry matches. Relief washed over her, a practical comfort against the weight of the home's sorrow. Before leaving, she noticed a worn Bible on a small ledge. It was left open, the page marked by a faded ribbon. Her eyes fell upon a verse from Psalms. "Yeah, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil." She closed the book gently, the words a cold comfort and a stark reminder. This family had walked that valley and not returned. Stepping back out into the harsh sunlight, clutching the salt and matches, Ruth looked back at the soddy one last time. It was a monument to failure, but for her, it was now a lesson. She would not fail. Leaving the sod house felt like closing a tomb. The air outside was cold and clean, washing away the dust and sorrow. Ruth led Apollo back toward her trail, the salt and matches a small, hard weight in her saddlebag. It was then she saw it. Not 20 yards from where she'd hidden Apollo, a set of fresh tracks cut across her own. 2 horses shod, they weren't wandering. The hoof prints were deep and purposeful, heading west directly on her line. Her blood ran cold. It wasn't paranoia. They were real and they were hunting her. The vast, open prairie suddenly felt like a killing floor. There was nowhere to hide, no way to outrun them on tired horse flesh. Panic clawed at her throat, hot and sharp. She fumbled for the map, her hands shaking so badly she could barely unfold the creased hide. Jedediah's crude markings swam before her eyes. Her gaze fell on a jagged cluster of lines and shadowed shapes to the northwest, labeled simply, Badlands. It was a place of legends, a maze of canyons and crumbling spires where a person could get lost forever. It was also her only chance. "Come on, boy," she whispered to Apollo, her voice strained. There was no more conserving energy. She kicked him into a hard gallop, the muddy ground sucking at his hooves. The world became a blur of brown grass and gray sky. Every few minutes, she'd risk a glance back. They were there. 2 specks on the horizon, slowly, relentlessly gaining. The rhythmic pounding of Apollo's hooves was a drumbeat counting down her life. She pushed him harder, her own lungs burning in sympathy, her eyes fixed on the distant, broken line where the flat earth gave way to a fortress of stone and shadow. The Badlands swallowed them whole. The moment Apollo scrambled down the first steep, crumbling embankment, the vast open prairie vanished, replaced by a labyrinth of shadow and stone. The air grew still, the silence broken only by the clatter of hooves on rock and Apollo's ragged breathing. The shouts of her pursuers became distorted echoes, bouncing off the canyon walls, making them sound both everywhere and nowhere at once. For hours, Ruth pushed onward, not running but navigating. She was no longer prey fleeing. She was a needle threading its way through a deadly maze. She followed a dry creek bed that twisted deeper into the earth, the jagged spires of sun-baked clay and rock clawing at the sky above. She found a narrow game trail, barely wide enough for Apollo, and forced him along the ledge. From a high pass, she looked back and saw them, 2 frustrated figures far below, their horses struggling with the treacherous footing. Her gamble was paying off. They couldn't match her agility. As dusk began to bleed purple and orange across the sky, she watched them confer, their voices too distant to hear. They scanned the impassable walls that surrounded them, defeated. Finally, they turned their horses and began the slow, arduous ride back east. Ruth didn't move until their figures were completely consumed by the landscape. A shudder of pure, unadulterated relief racked her body. She slid from Apollo's back and pressed her forehead against his warm, sweat-soaked neck, whispering her thanks. That night, in a hidden alcove, she finally lit a small, smokeless fire with the matches from the sod house. She pulled out the map. Under the starlight, it was no longer an act of theft or a tool for revenge. It was a deed, her deed. The silver was hers. The future was hers. Looking west into the deep, quiet darkness, Ruth felt no fear, only the steady, powerful beat of her own heart.